This Freedom Stories discussion is being recorded for use by the International Storytelling Center, ISC. This recording will be owned and managed by ISC and will be used for any educational purpose that ISC deems appropriate. By participating in this public discussion, you acknowledge this recording and its subsequent uses. Closed captioning is provided today by ACS. Freedom Stories, Unearthing the Black Heritage of Appalachia, is proudly supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities and produced by the International Storytelling Center.
Standing in the rain, they came for resolution that was missing from their lives, came to end the terror and the pain. 400 years of hatred, abuse and savage lies, fighting segregation and despair. They came in hope, believing that the world would hear their cries. And one man put his finger in the air. He said, "We're willing to be beaten, we will never go away. Did you hear what we had to say? We will never go back, we will never go back. Got our eyes on the prize, got this train on the track. We are here in freedom's name, and there's nothing you can do to make us wear those chains again." Stand here remembering that moment, in a future where we say that we are free, but the forces of evil and oppression are still here for every open eye to see. We are fighting in a battle of a lifetime, taking down those hated symbols one by one. Like our elders, we're fighting for the future. In their name, we will do what must be done. We will never be defeated, we will never go away. Did you hear what we had to say? We will never go back, we will never go back. Got our eyes on the prize, got this train on the track. We are here in freedom's name, and there's nothing you can do to make us wear those chains. We will never go back, we will never go back. Got our eyes on the prize, got this train on the track. We are here in freedom's name, and there's nothing you can do to make us wear those chains. Singing freedom, singing freedom. We are here in freedom's name. Oh, sing freedom, sing freedom, sing freedom. We are here in freedom's name.
Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for our concluding public discussion with Freedom Stories. I am Alicestyne Turley, and I've had the honor of being the project director for the International Storytelling Center series. And during this series, we have covered many topics, and we're hoping that even though this is our final public discussion, that the discussion will continue long after the close of the series. So, as always, I want to share with you, we're an NEH-funded project. It has been the goal of the Freedom Stories to bring together the folk art of storytelling, which is an Appalachian tradition, the humanities scholarship combined with elements of social action and tools. The approach was meant to guide the public through deeper appreciation of the role of African American history and stories in the creation not only of Central Appalachian culture, but American culture. The International Storytelling Center has been fortunate to be able to conduct this important work through grant funds provided to us for the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is the major funder of the project. And as always, today's discussion is recorded and along with all prior Freedom Stories are made available to the general public free of charge, no charges to look at this, on YouTube, International Storytelling Center website and Facebook pages. And in an effort to answer more questions, we've extended the time for today's discussion by about half an hour. So as always, we encourage our viewers to go to Facebook, post their questions. If you have questions for me or the panelists, please do so, and we will get to as many of those questions as time permits. So we have continued our tradition of providing you with excellent storytellers to begin our conversation. And today I'm very happy to say we have an award-winning performer to be our storyteller today. Mzuri Aimbaye is an internationally acclaimed singer, actress, playwright, and multi-award-winning one-woman playwright. She herself produced and for the first few years performed on her own dime the Fannie Lou Hamer Story. Her talents combine theatrical performance with a booming vocal range and versatility of an opera singer. As a performing artist, Aimbaye has been enthusiastically received in cabaret concert stages nationally and internationally, performing where she lived in Paris, France, and Rome, Italy. In 1998, Aimbaye was struck by the realization that she had never heard of Fannie Lou Hamer. Can you believe that? And as a result, she conceived the powerful one-woman play, the Fannie Lou Hamer Story. The story has integrated her voice and her performance in 12 very powerful songs that are produced during the play, accompanied by video montage. The play raises awareness of Hamer's civic activism, which led to the passage of the 1965 Voter Rights Act, which of course we're being challenged today. As Aimbaye has traveled the country with her signature performances before theaters, churches, colleges, universities, and civic audiences. So here to perform a scene from her award-winning play, Mzuri Moyo Aimbaye. And I know I'm stumbling, but I didn't want to just say Mzuri, so it's on you now.
Mzuri Moyo Aimbaye. Thank you, Dr. Turley. Yes, my name was Lorraine Teresa Pope, but I always wanted an African name. So when I lived in France, I had a lot of African friends. And so one of my friends said to me, "You are not Lorraine, you are Mzuri." And I said, wow. So it took me a couple of years. Then I had a very good friend who is now with the ancestors who said, I called him up, I said, Mtembezi, I need a name. And he said, Moyo, that means heart. Then sometime later, I called him back again and said, I need another name. I want something around, music. He said, okay, Mzuri Moyo Aimbaye, that means beautiful heart that sings. So that's where I am with that name. So I know it's a little challenging for Americans, but thank you. So a little bit about how I got started with the Fannie Lou Hamer Story. I was watching Gil Noble, and for people who don't know who Gil Noble is or was, he had a television show called Like It Is in New York City that was never syndicated. He had the most incredible people on that show. And Fannie Lou Hamer was one of them that I saw one day. I can still see it now in my head, her on the television telling about this beating that she took and how, you know, horrendous it was, and how, you know, she still, after that beating, did not hate people, but she was motivated to vote people out. So she said, no, baby, we can't hate. We can't hate. We just got to vote them out. And that struck me. I said, wow, look at this woman was beaten like this, and she still didn't have hate in her heart. And I was, you know, I had so much anger. I mean, it was so many things to be angry about, right, in the 90s. So, and as well right now, but, you know, and especially if you're not aware, you know, you just think you're just walking around in life normal, and then people are telling me, oh, Mzuri, you're so angry. I didn't even realize it. But after hearing Fannie Lou Hamer's story, I started to realize more of who I myself, you know, because she said she did not hate, you know, and she said she was using her power to vote people out. So I said, you know what? I need to write something about this woman. Now, I was a nurse. I did write poetry in high school. I didn't have creative writing in college or nursing school, but it must have been, as my husband says, it was a download. And I started going to the Schomburg, and I started doing research at the Schomburg. Wow, that started to touch my heart. Then I started hearing voices in my head. You know, I started to hear lines from the script that I'm using today. So I'm going to just read just a little bit of the lines that, you know, came to me after I started doing all this research. I was born in the Delta, but dropped off at the back door of the Mississippi. And I was laid out in the heart of these here blistering cotton fields, where my skin cooked, because that sun ain't knew no mercy. My feet was calloused, like the hearts of those whose pockets was lined with sweaty dollar bills made by Black children, starving men, and forgotten women. You know, mama say when I come from her womb, I had cotton stuck up in the roof of my mouth. And the scars that my granddaddy wore across his back laid quietly across my forehead. And by the time I was 6 years old, they say that these hair fingers was destined to be great cotton pickers. Seemed like the more cotton I picked, the more hunger would grab hold of me. It just wouldn't let me go. That's the beginning of the Fannie Lou Hamer story. So I continued to do my research, and I ran into a book. I found a book came upon me called For Freedom's Sake. Of course, I read Kay Mill's book. I went down to Mississippi. Actually, I went to Rouville. I met the mayor there, and I believe she's still the mayor. And I met Fannie Lou Hamer's relatives. But unfortunately, I could not connect at that time with the family because I believe that they had experienced other people coming down and asking them questions about Fannie Lou Hamer and writing books, and, you know, people were not compensated. So what information that I had to find, I kind of had to find on my own, but I had an incredible time down in Rouville. And when I came back to America, I mean, this was just something that was in my head. I had a friend who was a professor at a college in New Jersey, Ramapo. And I asked her, could I come and do a little bit of this I didn't even know if I called it a play. Maybe I said poem, you know, and she said, sure, come, you know, come on, you know, you can do it. Then I went to her classroom and I took my mother with me. And after I finished, it was, you know, wasn't even maybe it was a half hour. And so my mother said to me when we got in the car, she said, Lorraine, that was good. And I said, really, Mom? And in that moment, it's like it gave me permission to continue the work. So it's been a 20-year journey, a labor of love, especially with this COVID-19 shutdown. But we continue to endeavor to bring Fannie Lou Hamer's name to the fore. I had a director when I lived in Miami by the name of Desmond Walker. And Desmond said to me, Mzuri, if you had to do one thing, leave one message with people about Fannie Lou Hamer, what would it be? And I would say voting. That wasn't in the play at first. And so I added that part about registering people to vote after the play. And that's been about 8 years ago, or maybe even more. But after I got that, you know, nudge about what was Fannie Lou Hamer really about. And it was about getting out to vote, get out to vote, get out to vote. So if Dr. Turley, would you like to ask me some questions or should I continue?
You are free to continue. I know I want people to hear your beautiful voice. You know okay. that. I always want you to sing. I know when I was teaching, you came to the campus and our music department made all their singers shut up and listen. So, so if you're willing to share as much of your voice with us as you would, you know, as you feel comfortable doing, I would love to hear it. And I think our viewers would as well.
Absolutely. All right, I'll do another excerpt. Fannie Lou. Fannie Lou? Yes, sir. Did you go down there and register to vote? And I took and addressed him. Yes, sir, Mr. D. I did. Well, you know we ain't ready for this down here in Mississippi. Now, gal, what you gonna do? Mr. D, sir, I did not go down there to register for you. I went down there to register for myself. Well, if you don't withdraw, we gonna have to let you go. Well, I have y'all to know that I left that night because he might not have been ready, but we had been ready down here for the last 400 years. Now we should keep right on protesting. We should keep right on registering the vote. I want to know how many of y'all will go down Monday morning and register. If you're afraid, me and my God will go with you because we need people to vote for freedom now. Not freedom tomorrow, but freedom now. Well, I failed that voter registration test 2 times. And I just kind of looked up at them and I informed them, you're going to see me here for the next 30 days until I pass. Well, after that, I passed. But I still was not allowed to register to vote because they told me I needed 2 poll tax receipts. Well, I have y'all to know that I got my 2 poll tax receipts. And today, I'm a registered voter and a citizen of these here United States of America. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. All in my house, I'm gonna let it shine all in my house. I'm gonna let it shine all in my house. I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
Thank you so much. That was so beautiful. And I would say, whenever you're able to get back on the road, how are people to follow the link, which is in our toolkit, if you want to go see the full 90-minute play and to hear Mzuri's beautiful voice performing this heart-stopping story and learn the truth about Fannie Lou Hamer, which very much relates to what we're going through today in voter suppression and the ideas of who can vote. Mzuri will be joining us with our other distinguished panel members. So I'm pleased to welcome today in our public discussion, Lecia Brooks, who is the Chief of Staff for the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama, where she provides counsel to the senior leadership, assists with strategic planning, and works with people from across the organization to ensure Southern Poverty Law Center success, which they have been extremely successful over the years. And whether it's achieving long-term goals and maintaining effective daily operations. Lecia has also previously served as Southern Poverty Law Center Outreach Director. She has traveled across the United States, testified before Congress, and she speaks about hate and extremism, not only in this country, but abroad. She was also the director of the Southern Poverty Law Center Civil Rights Memorial Center, an interpretive experience designed to provide visitors to the museum and the memorial with a deeper understanding of the civil rights movement and the struggles to achieve what we all take for granted in American society. So thank you very much, Lecia, for joining us. We're also pleased to welcome Trina Jackson, who works for the Highlander Center in Newmarket, Tennessee. She's a Georgia native who is also the education team coordinator there at the Highlander Center. She leads Highlander's education team with grassroots organizing and movement building across Appalachia and the U.S. South. She manages 4 programs in their accompaniment work in economics, governance, cultural organizing, library and archives, and intergenerational youth organizing. Trina is a Gullah Geechee, yay, and a proud spouse of an Appalachian preacher. Welcome, Trina. Thank you for joining us today. And then last but not least, the fearless leader of the International Storytelling Center, Kiran Singh Sirah, who is the sponsor of this International Storytelling Center, of course, who sponsors the Freedom Stories and has dedicated his life to culture building and peace building around the country. Prior to his International Storytelling Center appointment, Kiran has developed a number of award-winning peace-building initiatives and programs across the United States and the United Kingdom. As an artist, he's also a folklorist, teacher, social justice advocate, and he uses the power of his human creativity to establish dialogues among groups, which the Storytelling Center does a wonderful job. Kiran firmly believes storytelling not only enriches lives, but also holds the key to building a better world. Thank you and welcome to you all. Please unmute and let's begin our discussions. So we are in trying times right now, my friends. You're all engaged in some very serious work, trying to bring peace and integration and all the things we thought we had achieved. So I want to begin our discussion just by talking about the impact of storytelling. And I'm thinking about watching the television of beginning with the George Floyd trial, the Tulsa, Oklahoma bombing, and we still don't know how many people were actually killed in that event. And the talk about police violence and police reform. So What do you think about this storytelling? How do you think it has impacted America? Has it brought us together, or are you seeing more distance between us? And I'd like to start with Lecia, since this is sort of your bread and butter there at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Why don't you start us off?
Thank you, Dr. Turley, and thank you to the International Storytelling Center. Thank you, Kiran. It's so good to meet you and good to be with you. Trina, Mzuri, thank you so much for your gift, sharing your gifts with us. You know, I approach the question about whether or not storytelling is dividing us at this moment in time. I look at it as storytelling. I believe in the power of storytelling. It's important. The fact that this event is happening right now and people are tuned in and listening and watching and wanting to learn tells me that storytelling is always important. It may not be comfortable for some people at this particular moment, but it's critical. I think about the proud African-American tradition of storytelling. I believe that we've suffered a lot because we have moved away from storytelling generationally. And so it just, does my heart good to know that we are engaging in it again. Some people, it will always be the case that some people are ready to hear the stories and some people are not. The stories that we tell at the Southern Poverty Law Center, the stories about hate and extremism, the facts about hate and extremism, the facts about kind of what's happening and what's not happening within our criminal justice reform, our criminal justice system, or within our education system, kind of these things that people don't want to hear. They're all somebody's story, right? There's not just data, not just facts, not just information, but they're really reflective of someone's lived experience. And I just think that it's so valuable. And whenever I can put myself in a position to listen, I always grow. And I think that I'm encouraged that I think that more people than it would seem are now have positioned themselves to listen. Sure, there's those that don't want to listen and who are talking a lot to drown out kind of the open and honest sharing. But I believe in dialogue, always have.
Wonderful. Trina, how about you? I know at the Highlander Center, it has a rich history of dialogue and bringing people together in peace-building initiatives. And I know that you are working vigorously with young people. So can you share a little bit about what's happening with you and young folks and registering in today's climate of stories?
Sure. I think that storytelling is a tool that Highlander has had in its toolkit for a long time. Even like the Highlander's almost 90 years old. We're gonna have a big 90-year celebration next year. And so much of what draws people to Highlander is not because they've been there, but because people have been telling stories for almost 100 years about this organization and passing those stories down. And so storytelling is what connects us to the past, and it lets us know what we hope for in the future. And so storytelling has been key, especially with our youth organizing and intergenerational organizing, because there are competing stories out there about what's happening right now, right? They're competing stories about how we got here. And so telling a compelling story that connects us to the past, tells us about our values today and what we're aiming for in the future is really clutch as we have these conversations around popular education, political education with folks who are young. Like now, I am probably, I think maybe one of the youngest people on this panel, but like dealing with people that like were born in the 2000s, people who are like 20 years old, and I see like their birthdays on registration, and I'm like, you were born this century. There's some things that have always been true for you, right? The first time you were conscious of a president, it was a Black man. So you've only ever seen like the Black man and that other guy. Those are the only presidents that you've only ever known, except for the guy who's here now. So this is just a completely different version of the world that most of the youth that I'm in relationship with and in community with, they have a different perspective on the world. So being able to connect these stories from the past, and not just stories, but stories that are compelling, because none of our stories are politically neutral. So stories that are compelling to help them realize where they are right now, how we got here, and also start to suss out where we're going next. So in Highlander, a lot of our work right now is using what people call the pop education spiral. And a lot of the grassroots work we do, the first thing we do is sit down with folks in the room, whether that's the virtual room or the physical room, and we're able to get back to that and just have people tell their stories. And we just listen and collect those stories. And what we do is shuffle up to the top the commonalities between those stories and have people tell us, like, what the problems do you see in your context? And we shuffle those problems up and we sort them out and say, here's what you said. You told your own story. These are the problems that you said, that you identified, and this is what you said you want to do about it. And we sit back and say, here are the resources, here's some equipment, here's some stuff for capacity building so you can solve problems in your own context and make that a sustainable model, right? And so our work is really accompaniment to whether we're talking about youth or we're talking about intergenerational organizing. We don't show up to do things for you, kind of the dip in and like do this and leave. We try to equip people to make change in their own environment and their own context. And a lot of that is strung together by the stories people tell about themselves, their environment, and what they want it to be when they tell the story the next time.
Thank you, Trina, for that. And we'll come back to several of the points you've made there. Kiran, your everyday job is bringing people into the storytelling culture. So how have you seen the impact of today's climate on what your profession, what you do daily?
Dr. Turley, thank you so much. And it's such an honor to be here with all our fellow speakers as well. And I want to support everything that everyone said. And I think a big part of my job is not necessarily bringing people into the storytelling culture, is reminding them of a culture that they're already part of. Storytelling belongs to all of us. You know, Alex Haley, author of Roots, East Tennessean, that performed at the National Storytelling Festival, said, without storytelling, we have no roots. He was the author of Roots. He understood that. As Lecia talked about, it's and Dr. Turley talked about this Appalachian tradition. It's an African-American tradition. The origins of storytelling began in Africa with our early ancestors. It was a tool for survival, a tool for rekindling, understanding one another, mutual aid, cooperation. It's a gift, and it's a tool for listening. And also, I would say as an immigrant, I've been in this country 10 years, as a new Appalachian, America is a story. Without story, it's just a piece of rock. It's the stories that make up a nation. When I was a kid, when I first came to this country at age 12 on the family holiday trip, go to New York, Statue of Liberty, we go to see Baby Shamu in Orlando, we go to LA, San Francisco, we go around America, because that's what we know. But maybe we have to understand the story of America, not everybody came through Ellis Island. We know that when 40% of African Americans that were brought here enslaved came through the ports of Charleston, South Carolina. Maybe we should have started that family trip at the memorial to lynching in Montgomery, Alabama. Maybe we should have started at the ports of Charleston, South Carolina. There are many ways that we think about it. And essentially, storytelling is a democratic tool. It belongs to all of us. And it helps us unpack the nuances and the poignancy and the difficulties and the complexities of what a value is to this country. There's no one person that looks American, which is one of the most beautiful things to remember. And multiculturalism has always been a value. It's embedded in this nation's story. And that's why I want to remind people that story belongs to all of us. And when we see that beauty and that diversity of who we are, don't be afraid of DEI, because it's your story too. Let's start with that.
Thank you. Well, we all plugged. You said some things in there I'm definitely coming back to, because the idea of multiculturalism, I think, is really what's under attack right now in our American society. But I want to go back to Mzuri and your performance of the Fannie Lou Hamer Story. How have you been received generally, especially over the last 4 years before the pandemic set in? Are people still interested in hearing her story? How relatable is it?
I think people are more interested now, more so. It's grown. The interest in Fannie Lou Hamer's story, as you see, the Vice President, Kamala Harris, said, we stand on Fannie Lou Hamer's shoulders. She mentioned her. And the other day, I met another sister that does a play on Fannie Lou Hamer. It's so relevant now. It's more relevant than ever. with these suppression bills, these 400, I think it's 485 suppression bills that are going on throughout the United States. So yes, Fannie Lou Hamer is so relevant. And I think that everybody's waking up to that fact. Unfortunately, it feels like we're back in the 50s, you know, that we can't come so far to go back so far. But yeah, so, you know, I think the voters registration piece that I do along with the performance is so needed and so timely, because people really, this election, they got out and we see what happened.
Voting is still the key, which is, of course, why you have the major pushback. Kiran, let's talk a little bit about this idea of multiculturalism and the idea of American culture that you experienced. Of course, we had a president who began his campaign by telling immigrants basically they're not welcome in this country. So how do you infuse this idea of everyone has a story and that America is a story? Can you expand on that just a little bit more for people who think that the American story really is not about immigrants or minority groups, but one specific culture?
I think one of the ways to think about storytelling is less of a linear process, less of a transactional thing, but really as a tapestry. In Appalachia, we can think about it as a quilt. It's a tapestry that brings the multiple complexities together. I'm reminded of 2016, and Dr. Bernice King came to our region, spoke on ETSU campus, and said something that stayed with me when she said, there's something that Black Lives Matter and Donald Trump have in common, in the fact that both phenomenons have woken this country up to the great disparities that already exist. And I think what's happening is that Black Lives Matter is a storytelling movement. And it's really when we've woken ourselves up to this disparities that already exist, then storytelling is the opportunity to understand that disparity, maybe even look at sort of commonality, how to close the gap to some degree. I'm wondering also, I mean, during the 2016 election, on the announcement when, you know, President Trump became president, you know, just a stone throw away, there was a group of us at the Senate building, bipartisan, Republicans and Democrats, that had a story circle. And we were gathered there to talk about what peace means to us. It was a long conversation, and we came to common ground to help move some peace policy forward. Because what you see on the social media is not necessarily what's always happening in people's hearts and why we came into this world. And really, storytelling is something that connects us to our humanity. It's a complex nation, but it's a beautiful nation. And we have to learn about the heroes and sheroes that make up the nation. Dr. King, Rosa Parks, many others, the everyday heroes and sheroes in our home and in our neighborhoods. Storytelling is a force. It can be used good and for bad. It can put the wrong people in elections. But ultimately, when storytelling is shared, person to person via Zoom, on the front porch, or in person, or at festival, then it's sacred. Because there's truth in all stories if it holds meaning to the storyteller. It's up to us to listen to what that truth is, to understand that meaning. If my intention is not transactional, it's to understand you, then I want to hear what your meaning is behind this flag. What does it mean to you? What is this movement? What does a statue mean to you? And that's the opportunity where storytelling creates a safe space for a very essential dialogue, which is so important to the story and progress we have as a nation. We can be a great nation if we can understand that we're working through the broken right now, an identity crisis. We have to work through the broken to create the masterpiece.
An identity crisis, Lecia. We have an identity crisis now. There are people not willing to listen. So tell us what's happening in the country now. And we would love to be able to share stories of peace and dialogue, but is that what's really happening in our country right now?
Thank you. Kiran, I'm struck by what you were saying about the stories and what stories are told when you alluded to kind of the story of the Confederate monuments, for instance. We seem to be at a place where I don't know that all storytelling is truthful. I think that current storytelling is motivated by or the result of a very intentional disinformation campaign. I do, though, as you said, try to listen to people to find their truth underneath that. Where we're at now is people are sharing stories based on what they heard or what they believe or what they want to believe. And that really requires me to listen even more deeply to identify what's behind it. About maybe a couple years ago, I was delivering a talk at a university in Kentucky around hate and extremism and how kind of hate groups are trolling around college campuses to bring in kind of more white men into the movement. And one, I'm struck by how did this Black woman, how did I from Oakland end up like talking to white guys about, the dangers of joining the white nationalist movement. After the talk, these two guys who were trying to be disruptive during the talk, and it's like, no, it's okay. I talked to them afterwards. And oh my gosh, these two, one in particular, who was, I could tell, a new recruit to the movement, was so frightened just based on what he said. He was so fearful. He was like, everything is changing. We're not going to have anything, speaking for kind of, white folks. So that really made me more thoughtful and mindful and empathetic around what the recent demographic shifts that have been taking place in the United States, what they have done, and what the white nationalist movement has done to advance kind of anxiety and fear and creating this whole kind of story around white displacement and white genocide that this young person believed deeply. And so I'm concerned about the stories that are being told in that vein to that particular audience who is vulnerable, concerned for their own safety, but concerned for mine as well. As we experience demographic shifts, and we will continue to do so, really ever since it was noted that whites will become a numeric minority in the country, it just set off this whole kind of fear and firestorm. The Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks and monitors hate and extremism, has seen kind of that reflected in the growth in hate and extremist groups and hate and extremist activity. It has certainly accelerated and animated the white nationalist movement. And as we, I know it's a lot, and it may seem disjointed, but it's so connected. As we talk about, as a nation, some people are willing to talk about the story of white supremacy as a foundational base to this country and how it began, and wanting to disrupt and dismantle that by telling true stories and acknowledging the truth, creates a whole nother layer of fear and anxiety for another group of people. And the truth is that those who would have us remain apart are manipulating that. And so I think it's becomes even more important for truth tellers to tell their stories. I would also just want to quickly go back to the thing about the Confederacy and the importance of the Southern Poverty Law Center has been doing a lot in terms of the removals of Confederate symbols from public space. It's important for us to recognize what we put in public space tells a story all by itself. And if we don't do anything to counter those stories, those false narratives continue. And that narrative is tied to, the lie of white superiority and Black inferiority. And those things, these things play on us every day. So anyway, I know that went all over the place, but
No.
What you were saying,
I was so hoping someone would touch on the fear. Fear is the basis of everything that's happening.
Yeah.
And that's whenever you speak of equality or inclusion, it's this idea, well, if you gain something, then I'm losing something. No one ever sees it as some gain for everyone.
That's right.
And Trina, when you're talking with young people, you made a very important point about them never experiencing the civil rights movement, the fact that they've seen a Black president, they've seen Black people in charge of things. How are they able to process what's happening? Do they understand when we talk about the removal of monuments and things from public spaces? Does it make sense to them?
Yes, it makes a lot of sense to them, because I think that they have grown up in a time when there's always been the internet, right there, and the internet has more images than words, right, and information is exponentially, the availability of information is exponentially more available than it was even when I was growing up. Like, and so the images and some of the words and the music that are moving across screens is just always available. And I think what they recognize is that they're learning to have to sort it all, and everybody is trying to influence them. And so a monument is no different from a Facebook advertisement or an Instagram advertisement that's trying to influence them to buy into something, that's trying to say that your time is worth this, your headspace is worth this, your money is worth this. And so I think that they can equate a lot of these monuments as just other types of advertising to believe a certain way. How does that advertisement make you feel? What do you associate with it? Like, is there some type of status that comes along with believing it or disbelieving it? And so I think that many young folks have a certain clarity about that's not it. Like a lot of the ways that we put historical narratives, historical people and their actions kind of sanitized of their intentions, they recognize the okie doke, right? And so they're some of the first are ready to like take down monuments or have them covered up or remove them to another place and have the conversation about putting them in a different context, which is frankly a reform from many of their perspectives. And so I think that they're very smart about it because they have so much information that they have to filter through. They can instantly see, many of them, now I don't want generalization, can almost instantly see the okie doke and say, I don't want that. And I think it's important to mention that I work with a self-selected group of young folks who already probably tend toward the left, right? And so they select themselves. Part of that is because of Highlander's history, right? And the way that Highlander has shown up over time, that some people will see know Highlander's history and say, that's not for me. So I'm speaking about that from the young folks that I encounter. And a lot of them are very clear. And I think this has been consistent across movements. Often young people don't have as much to lose by taking that kind of stand, right? They definitely have some skin in the game, but they have different things to lose. And so they can be a little riskier, right? And so I think that a lot of them are very aware that they are at a time in their lives when they can take a risk because they may not have a mortgage, right? They may not, have like kids that need to be put to bed at 7:30, so they can take some risks and have a meeting that starts at 9 o'clock at night, and start plotting and planning and be out there until 2:30 in the morning. I used to be like that. I can't do that no more, right? And they can keep it moving when I'm like, I need to sit down. Like I need to go home and go to sleep. But I do think that they have a sharpness about information that even I think that my generation, I'm generation X, and even my generation just lacks just a little bit of the analytical sharpness that they have. And a friend of mine often talks about the next, and who is, I guess that she'd identify as kind of a Gen Zer, right on the edge, but the next movement for liberation for all of us, at least half of that's digital. And so if we can talk about being in the streets and boots on the ground and getting information to people in different ways, but when we talk about grassroots organizing at this point, so much of that is digital, like being able to use the tools of either the internet or understanding how universal surveillance happens at all the time because of my Apple Watch and my Fitbit, my phone has GPS, tells everybody where I am all the time, and so they bring all of that into their strategizing of understanding the world. So they get it. but it's a lot.
Well, and it's a lot that we saw this past summer with really the George Floyd movement, the Breonna Taylor movement here in Kentucky. Those were all young people who did much of the organizing, who were boots on the ground, who, as you've said, had the time to be constantly in the street. So we have to consider what happens when you are in constant contact, when you've grown up with young people who are different, from all over the world. We are the melting pot that people thought or never want, maybe accept that that's what we are. But as a historian, I have to say, this is also what happens when you don't teach an accurate history. So when people are hearing or have this belief that America was a white culture, that's because we have successfully taken minority culture out of the classrooms. We've taken it from the public space and we've regulated it to conversations like this, rather than it being taught every day. So that's the benefit, I think, Kiran, of storytelling, is that you're able to bring in people who've actually lived this and who are adding to the historical record. So it's not so black and white, which is what the focus of our dialogue is today. So this idea of race relations and voting suppression, what suggestions would you make? And I'll give this question to each of you. What suggestions do you make for pushing back? How do people get involved? If they see what's happening but have no idea of how to start to make a difference, what would each of you suggest?
Well, I'll start that, answer that question. Of course, getting out to vote, but not just for yourself, but I, would encourage all of us to grab some young people. When I am out and there's an election going on, I stop young people and say, are you registered to vote? And I start having a conversation with them, whether I know them or not. Most of the times I do not. And quite frankly, most of the time it's African-American males. When we had Andrew Gillum down here running for governor, I would stop African-American young males and ask them, are you registered to vote? Do you know? They had no clue that Mr. Gillum was running for governor. They were so disconnected. And to be quite honest with you, it was really hard to get them in. They weren't interested. The attitude was, well, what good is it going to do? I myself, I got out and started knocking doors. And I had the privilege of taking a woman that was 93 years old to the polls to vote. So I got actively involved, for the gubernatorial election. So.
Yeah, we need to get a lot of folks involved down in Florida, definitely.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Let me tell you. Great weather, however.
No, go ahead, Mzuri.
I was going to say great weather, however, it's something else, I tell you. And, just getting the show into colleges in Florida, and I've been in Florida for now, all combined, probably around 15 years, something like that. I moved away and I came back. I used to live down in South Florida, but it has been very, very challenging in Florida. And but we can't stop.
Wasn't it also in Florida that John Legend and a group of other folks paid to have? You had a law there that allowed convicted felons the right to vote once they'd served their time, correct?
That's right. But what they did was they said people owed fines. So if you owed fines, you couldn't vote. So when people went to go say, well, what are my fines? They couldn't find them. They said, well, we can't find what the fines are, or they were astronomical. So I believe it was LeBron James as well, as a lot of folks came down and they paid, for people's fines. So it was amazing. And so, there you go. There's a contribution there. So that's the kind of thing that we have to keep doing.
Right. And it goes back to the Fannie Lou Hamer days of poll taxes. That's another version of a poll tax to keep you from voting.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know about Harry T. Moore and his wife, but they were They put a bomb under their house on Christmas Eve on their wedding anniversary with his mother. I think it was his mother and his daughter in the house. They survived. But of course, Mr. and Mrs. Moore died 9 days apart, you know, from the bombing. For actually what it was around, voting.
Right.
Voting.
We talked about that in our public discussion number 11, where we did feature that home that was literally, I think it's considered the first bombing during the civil rights movement there in Florida.
Yes. Yeah, Florida is something else. And Sweet Honey and the Rock have an incredible song, you know, to Mr. Harry T. Moore. I mean, it is amazing. If people who are listening can go online and listen to Sweet Honey and the Rock, this song about Harry T. Moore, you know, the bombing of his home on Christmas night.
Kiran, your view on this idea of storytelling and what we see happening in America today on the voting rights suppression?
Well, we have to ask ourselves, do we want to become Nazi Germany? Or do we want to grow into a nation that can be very unique and beautiful, where voting is a right for every citizen? And we're not demonizing the minorities or the immigrants or people of color, that we are creating a space where we are valuing every citizen as equal. We have to remind ourselves of that, you know, and we have to remind others of that too. We don't want to return to Nazi Germany. We don't want to have propaganda like Nazi Germany created against Jewish people. One piece of advice I would always say is kind of my dad. My dad's a great wise man. He, you know, was a refugee from East Africa. And he always said to me, you know, if you don't know where to start by washing the dishes. And the idea is you start small, because peace starts at home, movement starts at home. And that washing the dishes can be simply joining your local chapter, NAACP or Black Lives Matter or whatever it might be. It's also about joining a protest, learning, listening, getting involved personally. What can you do as an individual? And one example I want to really emphasize is a colleague of mine, a friend of mine, a young white female professional called Laura, in a town in Virginia called Stewart. Stewart named after J.E.B. Stewart, the Confederate general. And she was so moved by what was happening after the murder of George Floyd, she simply reached out. What can I do? How can I help? She managed to get a grant. She managed to be able to facilitate a group of people from across political backgrounds in her home. And she organized a series of workshops and events that unpacked, what does that statue mean? What does diversity mean? What does it mean to belong to a home? What are we trying to create? And that was simply the actions of a very soft-spoken, I would say, you know, good person, shy, but one action, one small action in our home. And I think everybody, we have that potential to even just record stories, record the movement, record what's happening in our nation, and document it as well. We can do that as young people, as old people. You know, we can do that as anyone. It starts small, but you're joining something that is righteous and really sacred. To bring equality and equity and to all people is a righteous cause. You know, it really is. And it follows the lines of all our ancestors in the sense that, you know, they strive for that, they sacrificed their lives for that, or they were tortured, or, you know, people died for this. And we have to remember that we have to work through that broken to create the story we want to see in the world. If you're a young person and you see this vision of the future about creating this, you have the potential to be that story and to make that difference.
And I know at the Storytelling Center, you also have a very strong youth initiative working with young people. Some of those images we used in the PowerPoint, where you're training young leaders to be in the Appalachian community, especially African Americans who have been told there are no Black people in Appalachia. I happen to be one of those Black people that was told there were no Black folks. And I'm like, well, geez, how did I get here then? You know, Hazard, Kentucky is definitely Appalachia. So this whole false narrative. I'm sorry, go ahead.
And I was just saying, it's also just reminding people of the story that already exists. in the sense that many people, young people, didn't know that the Emancipator began here in Jonesborough as the nation's first anti-racist newspaper, as an abolitionist newspaper. And I think when people realize that history, oh, this is in my hometown, I had no idea. And there's a reason why they had no idea. You know, there's a reason why. But when you remind people of where you are, and also there's a lot of interconnectedness, resiliency, whether it's Black Lives Matter or the fighting against voter suppression, resiliency is not just a tool, it's a value that Appalachian people understand, you know, across cultures. And when we connect that resiliency, then we realize the fight for equality is a shared fight. It doesn't belong to one group. We're in that together.
I just wanted to say very quickly, my mother was raised in Appalachia. She was from West Virginia. I just checked. She was raised in West Virginia. Yes.
That's definitely Central Appalachia. And the idea that it was probably at the beginning one of the most integrated places in America. You would not know that today, but this is really where America became. It was before that you were the British colonies. But once you came over the mountains, you had an intermixed community that still exists today, even as quietly as it's being kept, but it was always the most integrated location in America. So that's another false narrative, you know, that's been promoted.
Is that why, Dr. Turley, you said you had a lot of mixed race in your family because people just intermarried each other?
Yes, that whole Melungeon, which that was one of our public discussions where we talked about Melungeons and Appalachian, that there's still a large Melungeon population.
What is that?
Mixed race. It's always a combination of European, African, and Indian populations that have been here ever since people started coming over the mountains. But this idea of Melungeon identity was a criminal idea. It became criminal when we began to populate across the Appalachian Mountains. People wanted to deny mixed race heritage, but it still exists. And Lecia, come on, tell us about your work with young people. I know each time I go there, they're always, I being one who would constantly bring young people there to the center. How would you encourage them to become involved?
Well, I want to pick up on what Trina said around kind of today's young folk are not falling for the okie-doke, right? I mean, in things that we continue to believe and accept as truthful narrative, they recognize immediately as false narrative. I also want to lift up the youth participation in the presidential election was phenomenal.
Yes.
And I have no reason to believe that it won't continue as such. I think that the successes that we experienced in the presidential election, and in addition to the Senate race in Georgia that brought an African-American man and a Jewish American man to the Senate, was phenomenal. And people won't soon forget that. People need to know that their vote matters. And this was just a kind of a watershed moment to show them that. The Southern Poverty Law Center has been working with grassroots organizations across, we have offices in 5 states across the Deep South, and are really doing all we can to help support youth organizing and grassroots organizing on the ground. And as I say, I have no reason to believe that it's not going to get any better. Everything, the Confederate Monument movement, the voting rights movement, the pushback against hate and extremism, the pushback against teaching critical race theory are all issues that are embraced and addressed by young people. And so I think that we need to continue to acknowledge that. And then also kind of historically, internationally, change doesn't happen anywhere without young people. I mean, that's just a fact. And so we got to continue to kind of challenge ourselves on perpetuating that false narrative that the young people are not doing it. Any change that happens because of young people. And that, that's international. I also want to talk about the rise in anti-democratic values, because I think that it's very much tied to voter suppression and the rise in authoritarianism. And Kiran, when you said, you know, we don't want to be Nazi Germany, sometimes I think we do. There's a rise of authoritarianism that is very real and present across the globe. And the fact that we elected an authoritarian leader who embraced other authoritarians, it has us in the position we are in today, where we had the insurrection on January 6th. I mean, this is real. And so all of this movement that people would have us to believe, or, oh gosh, we're just speaking out for our rights or whatever, it's anti-democratic practice, and we need to recognize it and stand up against it. I recently participated in a series that Highlander started called The Elephant in the Room, that's bringing together progressive activists from the left and across the spectrum, looking at how we organize and what we need to really talk about to strengthen our movements. It's multiracial, and we're talking about kind of why we don't talk about white nationalism and authoritarianism and tying our issues in a more global way. Though we are, you know, kind of the United States, we are more and more influenced by global politics. And so we need to look at that and talk about that. And so that's something that I want to bring young people into, intentionally bring them more into that conversation around what it looks like, this practice of anti-democratic practice. Because like, as Trina said, they grew up with one thing. And so they think that's what the democracy looks like. And I'm telling you, I believe that with all my heart that our democracy is at great risk.
Yeah. It is at great risk. And because we've been here so long, we believe it's on automatic, that we really don't have to do anything to protect it. But I don't think people understand how easy it is. We saw evidence of that. You know, when you can say that January 6th was just simply like visitors coming to the Capitol, when we've watched on television people being injured. And I had to say to my young niece, like, what do you think would have happened had those been Black Lives Matter folks storming the Capitol? They would have never gotten inside. We know that to be true.
That's right.
You know, and so even young people today who are in high school, what do you think about this idea of the 16 states we featured in our PowerPoint who've already outlawed the teaching of critical race theory?
It makes me really sad and sorry, Missouri. You know, Florida signed on to that last week. I think one, you know, my empathetic self sees it as another.
Oh, excuse me, I just want to be clear. I'm not from Florida.
Oh, I thought
Jersey.
Oh, I thought are you in Florida?
I live here, but I've only been here 4 years. I'm not from here.
Don't give that to you, okay?
Well, yeah. I think my empathetic side wants to recognize it as another kind of evidence of growing fear. And I guess I just want to tell people or share with people that, like Brian Stevenson at the Equal Justice Initiative talks about all the time, we cannot be the country that we want to be if we don't face our past and reckon with it in a real way. All that critical race theory, all that kind of the progressive movement is trying to do now is like reconcile with our past. I remember the fears around when South Africa, you know, when apartheid was dead in South Africa, it was all like, oh my God, they're going to kill us now. No, that's not necessarily going to follow that people who have lived under the thumb of oppression are not going to, you know, in fact, become oppressors. People just we need a level setting. We need a truth telling. We need a restart, and the only way we can restart and become the nation that we want to be is by telling the truth. I just believe that to be true, because there's too much in the way of us getting to the place, you know, those high ideals that we hold. We're just cleaning up things. That's all. It's not a threat. I mean, we're just cleaning up stuff, and that will help everyone. It's not just for Black folk or Indigenous folk, Latinx folk, or people of color. White people need to be liberated too, like, you know, and you'll be liberated by the telling of the truth and facing the truth and reckoning, you know, having some reckoning with our past. I really believe that.
Trina, the Highlander Center's background is all about just that, bringing people together, teaching them the tools to be liberators. You deal with high school students. How do they feel about critical race theory? Do they think they have somehow been brainwashed by being told about our country's past?
None of the high school students that I know. And so before I came to Highlander, I was actually a high school teacher. I was a science teacher. I taught chemistry and physical science, and they don't know what it is, right? Like nobody is teaching, first of all, nobody is teaching critical race theory in anything but like graduate level classes, like not even in undergrad. Nobody's teaching critical race theory to kindergarten through high school students. And so they don't know what it is, but I think that they recognize, again, the strategy of what's happening here. Because when we take critical race theory out of the academy, ultimately this is about a competition around stories and who gets to shape what narrative. And they recognize that, right? They recognize that some folks are telling them that this is bad. And if you know anything about teenagers, and this is a generalization, if you tell them to stay away from something, what's the first thing they're gonna do? They're gonna go find out what it is. And so they're kind of like, I think they're actually in the way that some of the political pundits are moving, they're actually making critical race theory more of a thing than it would have been. And it's going to backfire on them because not only is it coming out of the academy, now it's showing up in popular ed. Like we're having a conversation about it right now for people who are not necessarily academics, who wouldn't have named it that. Named critical race theory as a thing, but now we're having a conversation in regular settings. And I don't think that's what they wanted. And so I think that one of the keynotes of critical race theory, because like, this is me like being a little revealing here, like I'm dangerously close to finishing my PhD, in which I'm studying the intersections of critical race theory, Black liberation theology, and the Black radical tradition. So I'm one of those people who thinks about and writes about critical race theory a lot. And I think that one of the keys of critical race theory is counter storytelling, right? Telling a different story than the narrative than the dominant narrative that's been out there. And it's not destroying the dominant narrative necessarily. It's supplementing, it's changing, it's reinterpreting a narrative that serves particular people and maintaining particular systems, right? I've been taking notes of what like my fellow panelists have been saying. So there's so many things that are running around in my head right now, but when we were talking about voting, I think that it's important to acknowledge that for a lot of young people, and I'm sure it's not just younger folks, but there is a certain apathy. I think other people identify it as apathy for young people around voting because we've been told, go vote, go vote, go vote our entire lives. And I think that folks can look at the statistics now and look at like the results and look at the Electoral College and say, there's got to be more than one tool in the tool belt. There's got to be more than one tactic because y'all tell us to vote and then they steal our votes or they suppress our votes or they purge the voting rolls. And so there's got to be more than one tactic there. So while we have lots and lots of young people who are doing the work to knock on doors and do the grassroots work of getting folks registered, there are other folks who are like, y'all want us to participate in a system that actually doesn't work well for us. And so some of our work is around compelling narratives around why voting is important, but that is not the only thing that we do. Like voting is the first step, right? It is the kind of the ground of our political and civic engagement. And so while I'm a fan of some of the work that's happening now around making voting like a rite of passage, like registering to vote as a rite of passage, doing celebrations around that. Like when I was teaching in high school, we had these moments where we would pull together everybody who was about to turn 18 and we're like, you want to register to vote? And we throw them a party, right? And so like, you are now able to make these decisions for your country. And this is the beginning of your citizenship, of your responsibility as a citizen to this nation. So you start here and you do things for the rest of the year, like the midterm elections are coming, in between, what are you doing in your community? Because what we know is you have to be involved for more than just showing up one day in November for things in your community to change. And so in the work of Highlander, I think, is that we realize that in between time, because, we're a 501c3, we can't, support particular candidates or anything, but we recognize that a lot of that work in between happens in the places where narratives are the most prominent, the most compelling narratives historically have become religion. And so religious spaces are where a lot of the work gets done. And I defy somebody to tell me that January 6th was not planned at Bible studies, at Sunday school, because the person who came and prayed in the chapel and thanked Jesus for getting them there when they broke, not the chapel, in the chamber of the Senate, they thanked Jesus, right? And so this wasn't just white nationalists, this was white Christian nationalists. And I think until we deal with the fact that there's this narrative that has to do with religion, that has to do with what the way God wants things to be, that we're going to keep faltering in this conversation about what's actually happening in this country. And so I think that one of the things that we talk about a lot at Highlander is how, especially in organizing across the South and organizing in Appalachia, we can't leave out the place of organizing in religious places, of how people do organizing in religious places and how that's connected to politics. Because religion is political and politics are religious. You know, anything about like these bills that are coming across, especially these anti-trans sports bills, people are standing on religious beliefs. These abortion bills, people are standing on religious beliefs for that legislation, right? And so I think that Highlander is trying to follow the work of say in Georgia. I actually live in Georgia, I'm in Atlanta. And so as someone earlier talked about the wins of Reverend Warnock and John Ossoff, well, what happened is the pandemic came, people weren't going to church because we're trying to be safe. Black Voters Matters went to pastors in rural Georgia. Atlanta, Augusta, Macon, we didn't win that. Rural Georgia won that. Black Voters Matters went to rural Georgia and said to Black pastors, we know y'all need some money because folks aren't coming to church giving their tithes. We will give you money, rally your folks, give them this information, bring them together outside. We'll make sure y'all are safe. We'll give you masks, we'll give you hand sanitizer. Rural Black Georgia turned Georgia blue. It wasn't Atlanta. It wasn't Augusta. And so I think that we have to recognize where the real work is happening and follow along. Again, we're here for accompaniment. And so young folks are again, taking all of this in and they're watching kind of the moves to see what is the next move? What do we do next? We're talking about critical race theory. You're going to start seeing Instagram, Twitter, young people who've never taken a critical race theory class talking about they're a critical race theorist because they're going to go and learn about it because other folks told them you shouldn't learn about it. And so we're following them to the next thing. And so I think it becomes very critical for us who are older to watch how these narratives play out, like and follow what folks are doing to kind of contest it. And again, we start with the political education spiral where you tell the story of where you are, you tell the story of what you want your world to be, and then you figure out the strategies and the work that gets you there. And I think that is where we are with a lot of our strategizing, where we're talking about intergenerational organizing or youth organizing. People want this nation to be who we say we want to be. And young people are willing to challenge it and strategize and fight over it because this is life and death. If the nation doesn't become what we say our tenets are, what we say our fundamental values are, it will kill them. It will kill all of us if this nation doesn't rise up to that. And they recognize the stakes, I think, better than anybody else.
Thank you so much for that, Trina, and for reminding me as a mother of a teenager at once in my life, how if you want them to do exactly what you want, tell them not to. So I really appreciate that. So good. Critical race theory now is in the headlines, and people are going to be curious to know what it's about. So we are beginning to get some questions from our viewing audience. So I am going to scroll and see what we will do. It says, with the teaching of critical race theory being banned in many schools, what can parents do to help teach their children, especially young children, about the important issue? So I think Trina just covered a lot of that for us, which is maybe this is better to study outside the classroom. Maybe the student needs to come to the classroom telling the teacher about critical race theory. What do you think? Kiran?
Invite the storytellers into the classroom. Get the storytellers.
Even better.
I'm available to come to classroom.
Yeah, invite them into the classroom, or on the fringes of the classroom, not allowed in. Just, you know, I think I think first and foremost, we need to stop telling teachers how to teach history. First and foremost, they're educated professionals. As a former teacher, respect the teacher for their profession and stop telling them how to do their job. First and foremost, I think it's, I mean, I agree with everybody. It was just an absolute shame. And I think young people are smart. They are the most savvy generation that understands storytelling more than any other generation because they're inundated with it. And I think, for example, if somebody says they support Blue Lives, but don't listen to the police officers when they're saying open carry is going to be dangerous for me, young people understand that. They can see when they're being fooled. And I think it's really important that we provide as much resources to put the tools in the hands of young people, of families, of communities to tell their own stories. And I think this particular toolkit is one of those examples, just one of many, but it's a toolkit for families and teachers and guardians and students themselves to access and learn about it for yourself and teach it for yourself if you need to. And then put pressure on the school boards to make sure that we are teaching it, because it's integral to the nation. And then I think, as Trina mentioned, that we will fold as a nation if we don't address our trauma. Anyone that grows up and doesn't address their own trauma as an individual is not understanding how you're informed as a human. You get to rewrite your story when you understand your personal trauma and pain. But that applies to a nation. If we don't understand the pain or the trauma and the nuances and how everyone's experience is different, the trauma will kill us. We have to look at it in the eye, come face to face with it, grapple with it. And as my girlfriend talks about as a painter, we have to work through the broken to create the masterpiece. And it's really important that we work through the identity crisis to become an incredible nation. We have that potential to be an incredible nation. We have to work through that story in progress.
Again, you bring out, I'm going to come back to you, Mzuri, but you mentioned school boards. We talk a lot about politics, but a lot of change can happen with that. Most school boards are elected. Most of the people who make the decisions for your children, you have a say in who governs education in your particular local community. Yes, Mzuri, you were going to add.
Yes, I was going to add something, a little sidebar about the over 200 anti-lynching bills that have been brought up in this country against African Americans, and not one has passed, not one. But this recent, unprecedented hate, Asian hate, they had a bill that passed within 30 days, swept right through the Senate and the Congress. And so I just find that that's very interesting, and how that compares to what our situation has been in America. That not one lynching bill has been passed, not one. All of the African American people that have been lynched and killed. So I just wanted to add that to the table and to talk about my VOTE, Voice of the Empowered tour, Vote, Get Out to Vote tour. So I wanted to just add that before time. I know time's passing.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. And for those of you who have not visited the memorial in Montgomery about American lynching, please do so. Because more than any other group in this country, and if we look at George Floyd's death, which is often referred to as a modern lynching, and there have been 188 deaths since his death in 2020. So this is very real. And again, not being taught, we don't say this, Black lives do not really matter in this country, which is why we have the movement. And one of our viewers wants to know, and this I'm going to direct toward Lisa, I'm sorry, I'm dry mouth right now. What would you say to people who believe that Black Lives Matter is nothing more than a terrorist group?
Well, I think you just said it. You said that Black lives don't matter in this country, which is why the movement for Black lives began. The Southern Poverty Law Centers often ask, like, well, why isn't Black Lives Matter a hate group? Why? Because there's a group called White Lives Matter that is a hate group. We define a hate group that as a group that maligns an entire group of people based on their immutable characteristics. The Black Lives Matter movement does not do that. It's about self-empowerment. It's about healing, the healing that Kiran talked about. It's about dealing with trauma and coming into our own power. If I can go back to the original story of the three women who founded Black Lives Matter and started and launched that hashtag as a love note to ourselves and just to a reminder to ourselves. And that's how Black Lives Matter began. So people who, if you, I don't know if you, whoever offered that, I'm asking you, please look into the history of Black Lives Matter. There's a website, tells you exactly what it's about, why it started, how it started, what it means. I just invite you to do your research and come to understand. If you want to have the words Black Lives Matter fall from your lips, then please know what you're talking about.
Well, if you have our senators who have told the country that Black Lives Matter is a hate group, you know, we have congressmen sitting in the Senate right now who have labeled it a hate group and compared it. I think we had one congressman who stated that he was not afraid of what happened on January 6th because they were Americans, but he would have been afraid if it had been Black Lives Matter. So
yes,
again, people have that impression.
I think it's people's personal responsibility to find out kind of what's real and what's not real, and not to believe what every politician says. And it's unfortunate. I mean, a lot of anti-Black racism comes from the lips of our elected officials, in addition to anti-Semitism and anti-Asian and anti-trans, all of it. So again, we are part of the responsibility of a citizen in a democracy is to understand what's going on for yourself. That's our responsibility.
Visit the website, learn about Black Lives Matter and why that it was even necessary to begin with. So another viewer wants to know, they don't live in Georgia or Florida or any of the states that are promoting voter suppression, but they want to know, what can they do if they are not in these states? Is there an organization they can join to help the states that are being suppressed? I'll leave that open to whoever feels they have the answer on that one.
Yeah, there's. Oh, go ahead.
Trina, why don't, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Trina.
Just a short comment. I would not assume that just because you don't live in the South that your state is not experiencing voter suppression. Like, and one of the reasons that we know about voter suppression that's happening in across like the Black Belt is because people are talking about it and it's going, and people are resisting it. And so one of the things that I appreciate about the writer Robin D.G. Kelly is recognizing that voter suppression it's been happening for a long time. But this spate of voter suppression is happening in response to our wins, right? So I'm in Georgia. And so I think sometimes, again, this becomes about the power of a narrative in which we always feel like we're playing defense. And so if perchance, which, you know, I'm going to say I'm skeptical about it, if perchance you were in a place where that's not experiencing any type of voter suppression, whether that's against Black people, whether that's against elders, whether that's against immigrant populations, if you're in a place where none of that applies,
or young people,
or young people, right? Like that nobody's vote is being suppressed, then first of all, that's a model for the rest of us. But I would dig in to see where is it being suppressed, and even the conversation about it isn't happening. And so you may be the one to lift up the narrative, because part of the narrative, I think, for us is that we're always on defense. They're always like suppressing our votes, but often that is in response to success that we've had. So we knew that something was going to come in Georgia when Georgia went blue in November, like for the presidential election, as well as for those two senatorial elections. And so I happen to be married to a politician. I'm married to a state senator, and they had been waiting, like they've been watching and waiting, and I'm listening to some of the legislative conversation of what's the other side going to do, because they are upset about what happened. And so they're gonna, there's gonna be a lot of struggle around redistricting this year, in revenge for what happened last year and what's happening this year in the midterms. And so I think that just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not happening where you are.
Thank you for that. That's a good point. Maybe that's just much does happen behind the scenes. Lecia, your comments.
I completely agree. Thank you so much for that, Trina. And I would just uplift that voter suppression manifests itself in a lot of different ways. You mentioned redistricting. And so that's one of the ways that it happens nationally, by the way the voting districts are set up. And I don't know of one because of political gerrymandering, the way voting districts are set up. That's a form of voter suppression as well. So,
and it's more than just the states that you're hearing in the news, that it could be going on right now, and probably more effectively because you don't know about it. So I would encourage the viewer to please check into what voting changes have occurred in their particular states. It says, how can white people best get involved with things in their communities? It seems sometimes that white people think they don't belong in the NAACP or a meeting in other places. So here's another white person trying to put themselves in our place. What do you say to this person? They feel they may not be welcomed if they try to join a Black group. So is there something else they can do?
Well, I would just say, I want to just say historically, the NAACP has always been open to white people. I mean, in the kind of in its earlier years, I was reminded when I saw the sign or the flag that said a person was lynched today. The NAACP was supported by white folks, by Jewish white folks, and still is open to support from any individual. So I think it's more of a matter of the person developing their own comfort. It's not, I can't believe that they make you uncomfortable, but maybe there's something about you that feels uncomfortable. And I would encourage you to work through that. If you want to work for change and you want to kind of embrace the experience of others and work alongside of others, then you're going to have to do some hard work around creating comfort for yourself. Or not. I'm not comfortable. I got to go in white space all the time. Like nobody said, you comfortable, Lecia? You good? No. I mean, people of color, we do that. We've been doing that forever and still to this day. So come on now. Come on.
Just a little bravery.
I just wanted to add, Dr. Turley, that the Spingarn Award is not, it's named after a Jewish man, which the NAACP gives that award out. It's a very high honor, the Spingarn Award.
So you see how one organization has been tagged as a Black organization, but it's always been an interracial group. So that might be a very excellent place to start. And Trina, in your case, isn't their history pretty much has always been an interracial center, correct?
Yes, that is correct. Like for especially early on in our history, say in the 1930s and 1940s and 50s, Highlander was one of the only places in the South where Black and white people in particular could sit down like elbow to elbow, could sleep in the same building. And in fact, the first place of Highlander where we were in Montego, Tennessee, got shut down because of some folks working against us, saying we were doing illegal stuff, because the de jure law was that it was illegal for white and Black folks to be together, to sit and have meals together. And so Highlander has always stood in that place on the edge of coming together and conspiring together, even against these unjust laws that said that we needed to be apart. I think that for the person who wrote the comment or made the question is, if there is difficulty going into multiracial spaces and predominantly Black spaces, be in white spaces, because again, a lot of this work is for white people to do with other white people. And a lot of the deconstruction that has to happen around white supremacy, around white nationalism and white Christian nationalists is a white folks to white folks conversation. And there's only so much that we can say and do to break those things down. We're doing some of our work together that's in our own affinity groups as well. And that's not to say there aren't moments when we come together, but groups like Standing Up for Racial Justice, SURGE, is a group for white people, by white people, working on racial justice for other folks, right? And so I think that some of the work needs to happen in single racialized spaces, because to be honest, there's no way I can say the things to a white person in the ways that a white person needs to hear and believe. I cannot do that any better than another white person would do, because you're gonna give them the benefit of the doubt, right? Because they know your experience better than I do. And so I think that it may be an opportunity to get down and dirty with some other white folks. Because I say to my friends, and I have these expectations of my friends and my comrades in communities, get your people. For folks who are talking about terrorism, if you look at the statistics, you read the paper, the group of people that goes out and shoots folks randomly are white men, right? So we're going to talk about terrorism, the people who are committing that against us in this nation on a regular basis. So I'm telling my friends, go get your uncle who's getting radicalized in the basement. Talk to your auntie who's saying like racist things at Thanksgiving. I need you to run some interference. If you think Black Lives Matter, run some interference with your family. You think Black Lives Matter, run some interference with the vestry at your church for how they spend their money. You think Black Lives Matter, run some interference on your school board, right? And so you don't have to be with us to care about us. And so I think that even that is a privileged idea. And lastly, like people think they can, and this is a part of how Black people in this country who came to these doors through chattel slavery, people still see us and our stuff as property and commodities, right? That anybody can just enter into Black space and they know what to do. Like there is an area of study called African American studies. Like there's Africana studies. Granted, you can get all our culture and culturally appropriate on the internet all day long. Khloe Kardashian has box braids, all of that. Just because Christina Aguilera can do all the runs we can do, and just because you can take our things and our culture doesn't mean you know us, right? Doesn't mean you know about Black people and Black culture, Black understanding, Black philosophies. And so take some time to learn, right? And get your chops up, and don't assume that just because you live around us or you've been around Black people that you know what you're doing and communicating to them. When I was an archaeologist before I was a science teacher, I had to study Mandarin before I went to China. Even though I know a lot about Chinese things, I had to study the language, I had to study the culture, I had to sit down and just listen, not give my opinion, not give what I know, but just sit and listen and absorb how people talk about themselves. And so that it may be an opportunity for the poster to learn on your own and in your group of white people before you wade out into these waters of being with other folks and thinking you already know what's going on.
Right. Thank you. Back to that original discussion, educate yourself first and do it where you are. Kiran, International Storytelling Center has always been, from what I can see in your history, an interracial network for people. So what would you tell this viewer or this commenter about how to interact if she's white and she wants to make a difference in Black spaces?
I think do what one of my former board members, Kevin Kling, really reminded me this past year is allow a story to be your guide. And when I say that, it's like, allow the story to guide you in the places that you live. Allow your opportunity to hear the stories of what you don't see. Allow yourself to also listen to a community, particularly a community that has been sidelined from the canon of academia. And I know that, particularly in African-American traditions or communities and Native American communities in this country have been sidelined from the canon of academia. The stories lie often in the oral tradition, in the communities themselves. So you're allowing yourself to let the story be your guide in the sense, go for that discovery, go search. It's the same as educating yourself, but allowing story to be your guide. And one of the other component of that, I think, is figuring out where your best place might be. And I want to give one example of that. And it goes back to a very recent event when the basketball students, kneeling during the anthem, big many people know about this, and I think it was 23 legislators in the state within a couple of days got a letter together, slamming them basically, which was so disheartening because it was during such a sacred month of Black History Month. And I think even though that happened, one of the things that I felt so much hope was a group of students, and the head of that was, I think, Seth Manning, who's a white man. Young students organized. They used social media, and they created a demonstration on their campus. It's their home. They're the students, against that. And I think that organization, using your networks, using your skills, using your networks, and that's not just on the streets, that's in the churches, the places of worship, in the family structures, and addressing it where you can with the power that you might have, and using that potential privilege that you may have to create action. And remember, we're moving the microphone to people that historically haven't had that microphone. And your job might be to help. How can you help make that happen? And one thing I'd also really sort of encourage is be really conscious of where the racism is generated from. We talked about in this conversation. There's a plan. It's a plan. Get to the root cause of who's writing that story, who's writing that plan, and what is inspiring those people to go and do the insurrection on January the 6th. Where's that coming from? Get to the root cause of that narrative, that scriptwriter, and address that, challenge that, whether it's a sermon, a minister, a politician, or someone behind the scenes that is creating this narrative to fool us, right? To manipulate us. Storytelling is sacred, and when someone manipulates it to create harm, like what happened January 6th, then they're abusing what's sacred to our humanity. And our job is to call that out. And we call it out when it's been used to manipulate, to create violence, then it's wrong. And our job, as all of us are storytellers in the sense, it's part of who we are, our democratic right is to call that out, find it, and address it. And so there's a few more about, I'll be quiet.
No, it's good stuff. I'm looking at some of these questions and I was just trying to decide. So I'm just going to throw it out there. It is, when will Black people take responsibility for their actions? When it comes to, I'm not even sure. I mean, I feel as though this is one of those underlying emotional questions that someone is struggling with about the violence that's happening, or the discussion we're having, is somehow the Black community is not taking responsibility, and I'm not sure for what. So maybe the viewer can clarify that a little more.
I'll say this: when America takes responsibility for dropping the bomb on Tulsa, Oklahoma, that it starts with America taking some responsibility for all of the oppressive, hateful acts done to African Americans since we've been here. We've had incredible communities throughout the United States that were self-dependent, that were independent. And no one wants to look at how they were destroyed. They just want to look at where we are, but not where we've come through, from slavery to success to now where we are now, fledgling. I mean, the other day I saw a young man walking down the street, young Black kid, and I just said, wow. I mean, I just said, anybody could just stop this kid for no reason at all and just harass him, of the police. And say, I thought you were somebody else. So I think that the responsibility begins with policing, and the responsibility starts with the United States government and the laws, and how we're treated. Like I said, no lynching bills have been passed for us. So that's, somebody else needs to, not just us, needs to take responsibility. And I will agree with that. For what, I don't know, but I think we have taken responsibility for ourselves on a lot of different levels. But you know, whatever the rest of that question is, maybe I could address it more in depth if I got the rest of the question.
Lecia, Trina, is there anything else Black folks need to take responsibility for? How can we make it better? What more responsibility do we need to pick up, do you think?
I'm going to invite my cousin to take that first. Go ahead, cousin.
Trina, she's throwing it to you.
You know, I'm going to try to exercise compassion here and assume that question was asked in good faith. And so there's like the intellectual side of me does feel like it's a straw man and that it wasn't asked in good faith, but I'm gonna give the benefit of the doubt here. And so I'll respond. And I said in my introduction that I'm married to a Appalachian preacher. And so I think that the question would be to ask the question that Jesus asked about, how are you going to remove something from somebody else's eye if you have a piece of lumber in yours? And so if the problem is that the feeling is that Black people are not taking responsibility for our actions, what's in your eye? Like, what are the actions that you need to take responsibility for to model that for us? Because I think that was the teaching of Jesus, is that, how are you gonna hold me responsible for something that you're not holding yourself responsible for? And so I think that is the first question. And then if you're in relationship with Black people as a result of taking responsibilities for your actions and actions that you benefit from. So it may not be your direct action, because we're talking about communities, we're talking about history. Like a lot of times we try to chop off history and pretend like we all just showed up here today. There are long histories that got us here. So whatever your community is, ask her of the question, are you taking responsibilities for the actions of your community? As far as I know, there's no other group of people in the US who had Jim Crow laws. There was no other group besides white people. There was no other group of people who systematically lynched people besides white people. There was no other group of people who systematically made legislation that said who could and could not marry others besides white people. There's no other group who were able to do that on a systematic level. I'm not talking about these outliers, a few Black people owned other Black people, but systematically able to do that and then pass down generational wealth as a result of that, right? So if you're going to like point fingers, throw stones, point out something in somebody else's eye and say, take responsibility for that, then you have to be sure that you're taking responsibility in your community, taking responsibility for you and yours of how you got where you are before you can assail that on other folks. Now, if you are doing that in good faith, then you must be in relationship with Black people and go ask them that. You must be in good and right relationship with Black people and go ask them that, because I guarantee when you do, they'll tell you about the work that's happening in Black communities to reduce gun violence, the work to get more than just adequate education for our kids, the work to take care of our elders, the work to care for our queer and trans kindred, the work to make sure that people aren't starving on the streets in our communities, the work to deal with addiction, because when we were dealing with addiction, it was a war on drugs. When white people are dealing with addiction, it's an opioid epidemic in which people get treatment, right? And so there's some real differences there, but our families were dealing with and still are dealing with addiction too. And so if you love your family and you love my family because Black lives matter, then let's be balanced in our question and balanced in our answer.
And I just, when you're talking about churches, I thought, slavery occurred under the blessing of the church, The church did actually bless the slave trade, and it's always been considered a part of a Christian duty in many ways to enslave Blacks in order to bring them to the light of the church. So there's all sorts of messed up, sorry, that's not proper academic language. There's been so many misconstrued ideas, which is why I think, again, we need critical race theory, we need social justice theory, we need you to really know, as Lecia has said, some background information. You need to really do some work, some reading and studying on your own to really kind of, before we start talking about responsibilities. So I don't think Lecia wants to touch it, so we will move on to the
Well, I
next.
just want to say thank you, Trina. I appreciate your pause and reflection, and I appreciate that, and I want to approach it in the same light. And I did come to the same place around self-education. I just read a piece this week about the impact of generational wealth, the lack of generational wealth, and the reason behind the wealth gap and what it has done to African-American families and Indigenous families. No other racial groups besides Black or Indigenous people find themselves in 3 generations later in worse condition than they were before. And so that information is there. And I sometimes wonder, and it's not hidden. I mean, I'm sure I read it in the Post or some basic media outlet. And I'm struck by what people pay attention to in the news and what people don't, especially when I recognize intellectualism and a value of information and facts that as a white cultural trait or value. I don't understand why you don't read why you don't read and believe kind of the research. This research is there for any question that you have as to the conditions and the results of systemic oppression that BIPOC communities continue to live with. It's there, and I just need you to read it and believe it. And what troubles my heart is that I feel like I'm put in the position to convince you, when the research, just the facts are just there. They're there. So I would ask.
You sure that's not just fake news?
Well,
Lecia?
I mean, again, that's what you choose, but like, you believe stuff when you want to. I don't know. I was raised to believe that, I don't know, Harvard puts out a research study, maybe there's some truth there.
Maybe there's some truth there.
I don't know.
So
we've talked about churches quite a bit. This viewer would like to know, white and Black churches are so divided. What suggestions do the presenters have to help churchgoers come together to work for understanding and social justice? Obviously,
if I could start,
church.
Can I start with that one? Because I want to pick up on something you said, Trina, because I believe too, like around the come get your folk thing. I often feel that around Christianity, like, Christian, what they're saying all this and that. What do you have to say? And I was raised in, the Black Christian tradition, of course. And so I don't know the answer to your question about bringing Black and white churches together, because I'm troubled by where Christianity is today, writ large.
Trina, you're married to a preacher. What would your spouse say? How do we bring the churches together?
Let me tell you why this question is funny. It's because I'm not Christian. I'm Muslim. I'm a Muslim imam, and I'm married to an Episcopal priest. We have a lot of great conversations, as you can imagine. But I grew up in the Pentecostal church. So if anybody asks you, I'm a Pentecostal Muslim. Like, from the womb to the tomb, I'm a Pentecostal. And so, because I believe in the Spirit. And so, but I do think that Lecia is right, that first of all, there's more than one thing, that the church is more than one thing. So I think it's arguable, and PBS just put out a special a few months ago about the Black church, that there's more than one church. And I largely, I won't say accuse, but that close, whatever's close to accuse adjacent, the church for white nationalism right now, because it's white Christian nationalism right now. And I think a lot of that has come through very particular dominionist theologies about what people believe about this nation, about what they believe God believes about this nation. And so let's be clear that while there's some overlap, the Black church as an entity only exists because white people said you can't be here, right? So the fact that there are different churches is because white people were selling us a particular Christianity, especially during enslavement, right? And then post-enslavement, there's a lot of struggle. And like, I went to a Methodist seminary, and I know there are other Black autonomous denominations like the AMEs. And a lot of those churches exist because white people said, you can't be here and worship with us, right? Because we believe God says you are less than we are, right? So let's be clear that there's some repair that needs to happen for churches to come together. Now, I know that there are some churches that are interracial, and I would ask questions about the leadership and the conversations they're having about that repair. But I think that for white churches, especially, and I'm thinking about the Methodist Church, white churches hold some of the most real estate and some of the most capital in this country. Like at one point, the Methodist publishing companies were the biggest publishing companies in this country. I think it's still true now that the majority of US American presidents have been Methodist or Baptist, right? So there's a connection there. And a lot of that has been because of colonialism and like missionary work, and where a lot of that money comes from. Like a lot of those resources come from historically, and that generational wealth has been passed down out, yes, in households, but also in institutions like the church. And so for white and Black churches to come together, there's some really important conversations that y'all need to have about why y'all aren't together already, right? Because white folks said you can't be here. Now, after that, there's a wonderful group of people that I work with here in Atlanta called Atlanta Protest Chaplains. And a lot of our work is to show up at protests as people of faith. But the other side of our work, when those things aren't happening in the street, is really to work on and write through theology for our folks of faith. Like I write progressive and liberative Islamic theologies. I'm working with Christians and Jewish folks and Buddhist folks who are writing progressive and liberative theologies to share with other people who don't feel like they don't have the tools in Bible study. They have dominionists, they have exclusionists, they have like American exceptionalist Bible studies and homeschool curricula, but they don't have theological documents to help them interpret what is happening politically. And so for folks who sit in my position, some of our work is to create tools. Folks can create tactics in their own context, but some of our work is to create tools so that when you ask a question like that, I can point you to a resource and say, this is what some of the African Methodist Episcopal folks in my area said they're talking about, and this is how they're using scripture and theology to support liberation for all of us, to support mutual liberation. Because this is the last thing I'll say about this, that we have to kind of shake ourselves out of theologically. We're often talking about talking through theologies of scarcity, and it shows up as politics of scarcity, that if this pot of money exists, if you have it, that means I can't have it. If Black lives matter, that means white lives don't matter. If trans lives matter, that means cis lives don't matter. That's simply not true. We have to come through with theologies, philosophy, politics of abundance. There is enough. There's more than enough. There's more than enough food. There's more than enough money. There's more than enough space. There's more than enough justice for all of us. So we have to move out of that place of thinking through a lens of scarcity. And I think church, because this is a majority Christian nation, church is the first place that will happen, the first place it can happen, a fundamental place for it to happen, to change this entire culture. And I say that as a Muslim, because this is a majority Christian nation, you got the people, you got a critical mass of people, you have a critical mass of resources, and you have tenets, you have fundamental tenets that people will give their money and their time and energy and resources to. Those are the three things you need to change culture.
Trina, thank you. Thank you so much. And we're out of time, but I got to throw it to Kiran. Thank you so much. You get the last word for this one as we leave.
One thing I would say, everything that Trina just said, I believe really speaks to the humanities. It's about turning off Fox News, as the former Republican governor just suggested, turn off Fox News, connect with the humanities, connect with people, connect with listen. But the reason I just wanted to say one thing very quickly is this is the 12th session of the Freedom Stories. It's the closing. And I want to say publicly in this format, a thanks to Dr. Alicestyne Turley. You have really, I'm going to start crying. You have really brought this program together in such a beautiful way. You've brought together scholarship, storytellers. You've helped each other, all of us, to cultivate meaning in these moments. And you've done it entirely through a pandemic. And you are, quite frankly, the nicest and kindest person I've ever worked with. So I'm truly grateful to you, Dr. Turley, and Linnea Salinas behind the scenes with our tech support, who's been the story behind the story. But Alicestyne, you've been incredibly wonderful to work with, and thank you for this work that has really, truly made an impact to this idea, but also to us as an institution that's also learning how to do things better. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Kiran. Thank the center. Thank all of our panelists. Please keep the conversation going. This is not an end. It's just a new beginning. Thank you so much. And if you have a chance, please visit all these wonderful resources that we've provided for you if you want to continue the learning. See you. Peace.